John Harris, and we have a special guest today. He has not been on the podcast before, but Eric Luppold. You can go to ericluppold.com to find out more about his work. He's written a few books on, well, what we're going to talk about today, which is ancient gods that Israel had to avoid, put up with, oppose, those kinds of things. And he has a podcast also called Governed by God, if you want to check that out. But I think the book we were talking about was Through the Fire. And we were at a conference and just started talking about his book. And I thought, this is really interesting material. We should have him on for the podcast. So here he is, Eric. It's good to have you on.
Thank you, John. I appreciate the opportunity.
My pleasure. So, tell us a little bit about your books and why you wrote them. And then maybe we can get into some of this ancient, I don't know what direction it'll go, but, biblical information, mythology, all of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the book that I wrote was a nonfiction book back in 2019. It's called Image of Gold, and I wanted to do something on idolatry. And so I spent a lot of time focusing on, okay, well, what did the Old Testament talk about regarding idols? What did that look like? The worship of pagan idols. And so that was a good book to make. I really enjoyed that. But then after COVID, I started seeing what was happening with things like critical theory and then transgenderism and all these like really strange things that a lot of people didn't really know what to make of them. I didn't at the time. I mean, I understood the connection, for example, between like the worship of Moloch in the Old Testament and how that connects with abortion. I understood that connection. That was a pretty clear one that was made. But then not understanding the connection with transgenderism or critical theory and things like that. So as time went on, I started reading other books. One book that was very helpful was The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self by Carl Trueman. I also began listening to the Haunted Cosmos podcast, which I highly recommend. But one book that really struck me hard was called Return of the Gods by Jonathan Cahn. And when I read that book, where his was a nonfiction book where he was looking at the ancient mythologies of Baal and Ashra and Moloch, and he was connecting them to these modern issues that we were having, these modern practices. And so then I started wanting to dive into the original sources. I looked at dozens of journal articles. I read the mythologies of Baal, the Epic of Baal, the Descent of Inanna, who's also Ashra, and all these ancient things. And it all started coming together where I started to see these connections between Moloch and Ashra. An example being that Ashra is an androgynous goddess, which I didn't know. And she claimed to have the power to change men into women and women into men. And that's why in the Old Testament law, for example, God said that someone that has, their like a eunuch or their parts removed is not supposed to enter the congregation and worship. And when I first read that years ago, I was like, I don't know why, God has an issue with that. But the issue is that in the worship of Ashra, those priests would remove their body parts and then dress as women and engage in inappropriate sexual behavior in these pagan worship practices. And God is basically saying you are not to have anything to do with that. There's a reason why God's law says men should not wear women's clothing and women should not wear men's clothing, because that's what the worshipers of Ashra did. The women dressed up as warriors and would carry axes and swords, and the men would dress up as women, and they would do these strange practices. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to write a fiction novel that was historical fiction that followed a pagan family living in the Old Testament land of Canaan before Israel invades the land. And so this family is worshiping Baal and Ashra and Moloch. And then when Israel comes, they have to make a decision as to, are they going to continue following their pagan gods of their ancestors, or are they going to follow the one true God? And so I wanted to go a route of fiction because people like Jonathan Cahn have already gone through the nonfiction route. But I do think that story is very powerful, and we as Christians need to write better stories than the pagans in order to address these issues of like transgenderism and abortion, which are nothing different than just ancient pagan practices that just have a different name to them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. And it's fascinating. I know I had said when we were speaking at lunch at this conference that it, uh, it sparked in me the memory of reading this alien book, The Alien Intrusion, that Gary Bates wrote. And he says at one point, he says, well, he's actually quoting, I think, someone else, but he has a whole section on these different alien beings, supposedly, that will appear to people across distances and language barriers. And there's these similarities that you can pick out. So, at one point, he says thousands of mediums, psychics, and UFO contactees have been receiving messages from Ashtar in recent years.
Mm.
Ashtar is not a new arrival. Variations of this name, such as Astaroth, Ashar, Asheroth, etc., appear in demon. I can't say it. Demon literature. We'll just
Yeah.
say that
Yeah.
throughout history, both in the Orient and Occident. Mr. Ashtar has been around, and so anyway, I just not to veer it into aliens, but it just he makes the connection that these ancient gods that Israel had to contend with, that weren't really gods, they're demons, have been uh, trying to influence mankind for a long time through many different ways. And even what we think of as new iterations really aren't that new. And so I think it does signal the relevance of what you're doing. Essentially, you're trying to expose, show, and educate people about these beings. And in a story form, I think it probably goes farther, or has the potential at least to do that, because people resonate with stories. So,
Yeah.
go ahead, maybe tell us a little bit about your story and some of the characteristics of Ashtaroth and Baal and these kinds of things.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, like I said, it's interesting that when you look in the Old Testament, the at some of the key pagan gods, the idols that Israel has to deal with, you almost always see those three together: Baal, Ashra, and Moloch. And you see this in First Kings 11 and Second Kings 23 as well. And sadly, it's King Solomon that seems to introduce the worship of Baal, Ashra, and Moloch to the people of Israel, and all three of them are brought together in First Kings 11. Now they do have different names. Like, I want to make this pretty clear because it can get a little confusing where you have Ishtar and Inanna and Ashra. They're just different names of the same god, because different cultures will have different languages. Okay, you have the Sumerians. Okay, you have the Egyptians and the Canaanites. So an example being that in the Old Testament, Chemosh or Chemosh is the same god as Baal, or Moloch is also pronounced Milcom. So there's different pronunciations and spellings of these gods, but they go together. And big picture wise, looking at the mythology, in the mythologies, Ashera or Inanna, she has to sacrifice someone to escape death. So in the story, she goes to the underworld, and the god of the underworld is basically won't let her leave unless she offers a sacrifice in her place. So to escape death, to avoid death, and to have life, she must sacrifice someone. Now, in the stories, she typically sacrifices Baal. But also in the stories, when Baal dies, he comes back to life stronger. And he's the storm god. So you'll see, like, if you remember the story of Elijah and the prophets of Baal, and Elijah says, "Okay, well, why don't you call for him?" And they're cutting themselves and they're dancing, because the idea is that Baal is dead, he's gone, and you have to bring him back, usually with some kind of blood sacrifice or offering, and then he brings blessing, he brings fertility, he brings the rains, he brings the storms. And Moloch is very similar. He's the god of death, the god of life and death, a fertility god. So the idea being that if you offer your child to Moloch, you will not only protect yourself from disaster and judgment, but you are going to have a better harvest. You're going to have a better family, more children in the future. So you want to sacrifice your child now so you can have better children and a better future and a better economic blessing in the future. So these all go together, where Ashra needs to escape death, and a lot of times you see this with abortion. I mean, the practice of abortion, a lot of the belief or the psychology is that the woman feels like either her or the child has to die, that to keep the child would be a death of her current life. Her
Hmm.
current life would be a death. So someone has to die. And in this case, it'd be better for the child to die. But that's okay, because it's actually better for the child that the child doesn't have to live in poverty or in a horrible life. So she can have a better family in the future. So the stories all connect there, and I think they connect today with what we see with abortion.
So before we get into the modern stuff, let me
Yeah.
just make sure I get this straight. So the sacrificing to Baal, I'm a little confused because it sounds like Ashtaroth is, or Asher is the god that needs the sacrifices to come back, right?
Hmm.
So what's the point? So Baal has I guess been sacrificed and is
Yeah. Yeah.
has so what's the point of sacrificing to Baal then?
No. So she's. My apologies if I wasn't very clear. She sacrifices Baal to Moloch. So
Oh, to Moloch.
the
Okay,
god of the underworld demands payment
I see now.
in exchange for her life. It's kind of a zero-sum game. Either you die, or someone else that's close to you, that's dear to you, has to die. And so she picks Baal to die. Baal must die to appease Moloch, but that's okay because Baal will come back.
So
Um,
when they would sacrifice, I mean, because the children being sacrificed were being sacrificed to Baal, right? But
to
it's not.
Moloch.
It's to Moloch. Okay.
Yeah. There is
So
some confusion though there, because like I said, this is very decentralized. So
yeah,
there's no like one source document that has, and if you read them all, you'll be like, that's a little strange and that's a little confusing, because it's all decentralized. So imagine all these little towns, villages, they have similar overlapping themes, but then they talk to each other and they exchange stories. And then this mythology kind of builds from
yeah.
there.
Because I know throughout Scripture there there's so many references to the places of
Mm.
Baal. That's where the children
Mhm.
were burned in the offering. So I think I
Mm.
just always assumed that it was to Baal that
Mm.
these children were being sacrificed. You're saying, and I know obviously Moloch
Yeah.
is brought in there as well, but that even the sacrifices supposedly to Baal are really to Moloch.
Yeah. So here this might help a little bit too. So the word Baal just means Lord. That's all it means in the original language. And Moloch is just means king. Okay, it just means king. So Melkart would be king of the city. That was what the people of Tyre, they worshipped a god named Melkart, but it's just the letters are king of the city. And so Moloch was this half bull, half human person. So if you look at images online of statues of Moloch, it was almost like a minotaur kind of figure, the head of a bull and the body of a man, and with the arms extended outward to receive the children that would be sacrificed. So, in the statue was often of bronze, and in the Old Testament, this statue, or one of the places of this sacrifice, was in the Valley of Hinnom.
Hmm.
So, and it was just outside of Jerusalem, the Valley of Hinnom, the Valley of the Sons of Hinnom was the original name there, and that's where people would come to offer their children to Moloch. And if you offered the child, that was the greatest sacrifice. So you could enter into the most holiest place if you offered that sacrifice. Some people offered birds, some people offered just animals and things like that, but they never got to the inner chamber, if you will. You had to offer a child to get into the inner chamber where the actual God was, and to get the greatest blessing. Now, later on, some of the kings of Israel, I think Josiah was one of them, where he destroyed the valley of Hinnom and turned it into a garbage dump.
Hmm.
Okay, and so that, and it's interesting because that's where, when Jesus talks about the place where the fire is not quenched and the worm does not die. He's referring to Gehenna, which is hell, right? The word for hell is Gehenna, and Gehenna comes from the word Hinnom, the valley of Hinnom, Gehenna, the valley of Hinnom. So when Jesus is talking about the place of hell, that is the place where babies were sacrificed in the Old Testament, outside of Jerusalem. That's the garbage dump outside of Jerusalem, and that
Absolutely.
was to Moloch. But yeah, so Baal was just named for Lord. Baal Peor, just all these different lords of different locations. You had a variety of Baals.
I see.
Yeah.
So
So
Bael's
and I
not one firm, like stationary figure. Bael could be a number of different, could describe a number of different supposed deities.
Yeah, I found this quite fascinating when I did my research on Baal. But you remember Baal Zabul, it mentioned in the Old Testament, Baal of Zabul, Lord of the lofty heights, is what that's referring to. He's Lord
Mm.
of the air, or Lord of the lofty heights. But the Israelites make fun of that. They make fun of Baal Zabul, and they change the letter of the last letter to Zabub. Baal Zabub. So that's where we get Beelzebub from.
So that's a mocking term,
It's a mocking term, and Jesus references Beelzebub when the
right?
Pharisees accuse him of casting out demons by the prince of demons. They're saying he's casting out demons by Beelzebub, and Beelzebub means Lord of the flies, or Lord of the dung heap, Lord of poop,
Mm.
essentially. Because if you recall, Elijah kind of makes fun of them for trying to bring
Yep.
about Baal's return. Like, well, maybe he's in the bathroom. Maybe he's unavailable right now. And when they destroy the temple of Baal, they turn it into a latrine.
Hmm.
So he, in a sense, what they're making fun of him in the New Testament, calling him the Lord of the flies, the Lord of the dung heap. So,
Well, that's
anyways,
fascinating. Yeah, that I mean that does have implications too for how we interact to some extent with other false religions, because there is this, I think, level of respect and mutual respect you're supposed to have in a pluralistic, multicultural society. Um, but
yeah,
and oftentimes, the example of Jesus is appealed to because of his mildness, supposedly, right? But that's fascinating that they would mock this god by changing the name and giving this god a nickname, as it were, that described the opposite, or at least, instead of this regal figure in the air, now it's a dung heap. That's just uh,
yeah,
that's rich. I
yeah.
didn't understand that. That's amazing.
Well, there's
Um,
also a connection, if I may just point out,
please.
with when Paul talks about in Ephesians the prince of the power of the air. So that's
Yeah, I
where you
thought of that.
start to
Yeah.
see those connections where, okay, the prince of demons, the Beelzebul, the lord of the air, the lord of the flying spirits, the lord of the demons, that that is who Paul is. Why does Paul use that terminology of prince of the power of the air? Because that's how they understood the demons to be. They were around in the air, floating around, um, seeking whom they might attack or devour.
So these three figures, Moloch, Baal, and Ashtra,
Mhm.
they not only were in the Canaanite religions. It sounds like you said Sumerian. Did you say Egyptian as well? Like these figures emerge in these other surrounding cultures.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me give you the probably the best example would be Zeus. I mean, Zeus is a storm god who wields thunder and lightning as one of his weapons. Well, Baal is the same way. Baal was considered a storm god, and so is Thor in Norse mythology. So you see a lot of this overlap there. Um, and then with regards to let's say Moloch, well, the if you look at the movement of peoples, so when the Canaanites were displaced, their descendants were also known as the Phoenicians. Phoenicians, the Phoenicians, and they settled in North Africa, in a place called Carthage. And you can look this up. They found in Carthage remains of child sacrifice. going on. And there are ancient Greek and Roman historians that describe what the Carthaginians did in honor of their god Cronus. So Cronus was their version of Moloch, and these people would offer their children as a burnt offering in order to gain a blessing and to get protection for the future. And Cronus, uh, that version of Cronus, in Latin is Saturn. So Saturn and Cronus are the same god, just different names for the same god. And Cronus is the one that devours his children. If you see the famous painting of Saturn or Cronus as the guy that's eating his children. Cronus devours his children. So that's just an
Wow.
example of how these gods they just have different names throughout culture.
What about Asherah, Asher, this god that supposedly, I don't know whether it, was poles or groves of trees, but they have these poles that are constantly being mentioned in
Yeah,
First and Second Kings.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
The
and
Ashra poles.
well, this is the one I just referenced from the alien intrusion that
Hmm.
this alien Asher shows up to people and stuff. So what's you said androgyny is part of the characteristic. So I'm assuming you're going to link that to the modern LGBT movement in some way. But tell us a little bit about her or it, he, him, Zazer. I don't know.
Well, yeah, no, it's that was interesting too. You'll see connections in Venus and Aphrodite with Ashra. So, in my research, I found that there is a statue of Aphrodite. I think the statue is in Sweden or Norway now. It's in a museum somewhere. But the statue is of a woman. She's lifting her skirt, but underneath are male genitalia, and there is a statue, or they did a worship of a god called Hermes of Aphrodite, or something like that, and there was a connection where that's where we get the word hermaphrodite comes from.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
Yeah, the word
I didn't even
hermaphrodite comes
notice
from
that.
this god of Hermes of Aphrodite, which is like a both male and female kind of god. Um, and they associated Aphrodite or Venus with the moon, which has two sides, a dark side and a light side. And so you'll see these connections where there's not just this gender mixing connection, but there's also this sex and violence connection. Um, and you'll see this in when you do research on, like, if you look up some of the worship of Ashra or Anana, where on the one hand she acts like a prostitute. She's very, very sexual, okay, but then she acts like a warrior. In these mythologies, this person is massacring all these people, and her axe is covered with blood. She's a very violent person, so it's both violent and sexual at the same time. She's that warrior prostitute, if you will. And you see this with Athena, who's the goddess of war, very sexual but also very warlike. So you see these two sides going on there. So sex and violence, as well as kind of transgender or even androgynous, if you will. So that's kind of the connections that you see in the ancient pagan worship.
Because you mentioned that Ashtoreth is associated with stars, or sorry, the moon,
Hmm.
but I'm just thinking of verses where it talks about, like in Deuteronomy, God warns the children of Israel to not worship the sun, moon, and stars. And is that what he's talking about? Are these gods that are associated with these uh, planetary? Uh, I don't know if it's. Well, you said Venus too earlier there. So
Yep.
these heavenly bodies.
Yeah, it is. It is a little interesting that you have connections with Saturn and Venus and the moon and things like that. So, I mean, like I said, I'm a fan of the Haunted Cosmos podcast, and I think there's something spiritual going on there with when humans are looking to the heavens, and we're making strange connections with spiritual beings in these celestial bodies. But these spiritual beings are ultimately demonic, and we're associating worship with these things. Yeah, there's a strangeness to it that's really a bit of a mystery in
It
all
makes
honesty.
sense to some extent that because when you look at the stars, you're overcome with wonder. You feel small, and there's something
Mhm.
transcendent, and you can't. Well, even like you watch like Cosmos, the old episodes of that show, which supposedly I'm trying to remember who's the guy that hosts that. I'm trying to remember his name
Oh,
now.
yeah, I forget his name too.
Yeah, the atheist guy. Let me just look it up.
Oh,
Who
yeah. Oh,
hosted Cosmos?
his voice, I can hear his voice and I can see his face, but
Yeah, not Neil deGrasse Tyson. That's
oh,
the
not
new
oh, it's not
guy.
him?
No,
Okay.
no, no.
So
Well,
I was thinking of Neil
he could
deGrasse
apply
Tyson.
to this too. No, there's the
Okay.
70s the original Cosmos.
Is it Isaac Asimov?
No,
No, no,
no. Carl
no.
Sagan. Carl
Carl Sagan.
Sagan.
Okay.
Yeah, he
Okay.
was so and he had like a famous quote that he would say that I think it was something like the cosmos or the universe is all there ever was, all there ever will be, all there is, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, but when you watch that, not that I did a lot, but I dabbled. I would, it was science, so it was cool sometimes, but very, very evolutionary and materialistic. And he couldn't help but look at the planets or just things that were incredible in creation and feel that deep sense of transcendence and awe and wonder. And, when you go to an IMAX and any National Geographic type science, animal, whatever presentation, they're always speaking. Even the music in the background is often like very mystical and like, so when you look at the stars, all I'm saying is like I can see someone looking at that and feeling small, and then uh, it exuding a sense of wanting to worship and wanting to. I mean,
Mhm.
that's the heavens declare the glory of God, though, right? And so that's what we're supposed to. We're supposed to direct our worship towards the object who created these things, but they misdirect it towards those things themselves, and then these demons swoop in as the receivers of the worship that you would naturally, I think, give when you see those things.
Yeah.
That's my interpretation. But
No, yeah, absolutely. I think that there is a clear connection there, and as I was, doing research on I was trying to think like, well, are the are there other cultures, and I think that there are. There's all these parallels with other cultures regarding these same practices. I read one account of a an early Catholic explorer. I think he was French to the New World. So I think 1600s. He was in the Louisiana territory when it was basically being explored by the French, and they was talking about encountering Indians, and he described how some of these Indians would have these dreams where they were different genders, and then they would follow these dreams. So they would have these male Indians would act like and dress like women because they were communicated to in a dream by this being, this androgynous being that's telling them that they need to act like this. So um, you know, I kind of wonder if nothing new under the sun, right? Now we're saying that they're UFOs and they're aliens, but are they really just demons? In all honesty.
yeah, we'll get behind some of this androgyny, and if you will, because obviously abortion and the LGBTQ plus movement are two things that you can link up with, or at least find parallels with some of what you're talking about. At least they jump out to me. And
Hmm.
um, when someone cross dresses or says, tries to change their gender, even doing these surgeries and so forth, uh, like I don't think they're well, at least I haven't heard anyone who has proclaimed publicly that they're doing this because they want to be like some god. They're not saying that Ashtaroth is telling them to do this. But what's the connection then in your mind? First, an advertisement from one of our sponsors. Are you concerned about what your children are reading? Mudhen Mama understands how difficult it can be to find books that align with your family's values. That's why they've carefully curated a collection of quality books for the whole family from preschool to adults. Mudhead Mama offers an alternative to traditional book fairs, selecting books that celebrate truth, beauty, and goodness. With a wide range of genres, including classic literature, biographies, historical fiction, and more, their mission is to provide literature that fosters character and virtue in readers of all ages. Founded Founded by Michelle Lazor, a mother of 10, Mud Hen Mama is committed to empowering parents to guide their children's hearts and minds through thoughtful, faith-filled reading choices. For families looking to fill their shelves with books that educate, inspire, and reflect their values, visit mudhenmama.com today and discover the perfect book for every reader. Mud Hen Mama, where literature meets faith and values, without the Darwinism, critical race theory, and liberal agenda. Use the code Harris to get 10% off your order. Go to mudhenmama.com today. Now, back to the show.
I think that, in all honesty, it is a connection to how to destroy the image of God in man. That's what I would say. If God made man in his image and you have male and female, if you are on the side of the demons, what would you want to do to destroy that? Well, you can't get God directly. You can't get him directly. So the best thing you can do is go after the image of God. And so, well, you do that by destroying all distinctions between genders. You destroy all distinctions between genders. You destroy the family. You want to destroy the children. You want to kill the image of God wherever you can find it, and you want to be as fruitless as possible. So fruitless, sex, homosexual behavior, bestiality, things like that, and anything that you can do to undermine and overthrow a god. And what's interesting is that's what Ashra is all about. She's all about blurring distinctions, overcoming differences, overcoming any kind of design features that God has made, tearing down hierarchies, tearing down structures, things like that. So that's where I think that feminism and the LGBTQ plus movement, their queer theory, they're all tied together with this. There is no such thing as male and female. It's a social construct. It's an arbitrary distinction. Humans are just interchangeable, like cogs in a machine. They're and that takes away the humanity of them. And I think it's an attempt to destroy the image of God.
So, question then, going back to ancient times and the Canaanites, when they had these poles, these Ashra poles, what did they do with these poles? What was happening there, and how did that connect to what we're dealing with today, or does it connect?
Yeah, I think that you'll see a lot of overlapping with the Ashra poles and totem poles. So
Oh,
again, I think that there's so much overlap in these cultures that you're going to see these patterns repeating themselves in different cultures. So the Ashra pole, I believe it probably originated with just like a dead tree stump. And but then they would begin to decorate these tree stumps and then actually carve and craft these Ashra poles. And I would envision them to be something like a totem pole, where and then these poles were usually near stone altars. So Ashra and Baal, like I said, they kind of go together in a lot of places. In the Bible talks about on every high hill and under every green tree is a common phrase that's used, where you find these Ashra poles and these high places, right? Because the high places, again, put yourself in the mindset of an ancient person. The closest you can get to heaven is on the top of a mountain. Mountains are places of power. Okay, that's where heaven and earth meet. Okay, so and that's where you get the idea of the Tower of Babel, where we're gonna build a tower to the high heaven. We're going to reach heaven ourselves by our own strength. We're gonna make a name for ourselves. Well, same idea. Mountains are places of power. That's where heaven and earth touch. And so a lot of times they would engage in these worship practices on the tops of mountains, on the tops of hills, with these Ashra poles and these altars. And a lot of it would involve sexual behaviors. The priest of Ashra, the priest of Baal, and the priestess of Ashra, they would engage in sexual intercourse publicly, in order to represent, the heaven and earth coming together, God and mankind coming together, being unified and bearing, quote unquote, fruit or blessing, things like that. So again, and then tied with that, you have the human sacrifice. So So a lot of these things all go together. You have witchcraft, you have abortion or child sacrifice, and you have sexual perversion. And all three of those things go together. And
Mm.
I think you begin to see in our modern age that they do go together.
Yeah, there's a return of these gods, as you said before. In a sense. What about Diana? Because I was thinking, like, there was when Paul talks about
Yep.
the worship of Artemis or Diana, the same god there or false god.
Just different name.
What is there a connection between Ashra and Diana?
Mhm.
Because there's also that androgyny going on there.
Yep, absolutely. I did some research on the temple of Diana or Artemis. Same goddess, different name. Depends what language you're referring to. But if you look at the temple of Artemis or temple of Diana in Ephesus, guess who ran that temple? It was manned or run by thousands of male eunuchs, men who would remove their body parts and often dress as women and engage in homosexual sex with people that were coming to worship there. So it is all very much tied together. These ideas were borrowed, they were exchanged, with commerce or with warfare. Like I said before, the Canaanites and the Phoenicians, and then they settle in Carthage, and Carthage is now engaging in these practices. And then the Romans, they borrow some of these practices. They had an event called the Gala. The Romans did. It's
Mhm.
described by some of the Roman historians, Gala, or maybe there's two L's. But the idea was during these ceremonies, uh, men would be cutting themselves, and then these boys would just up and decide to remove their body parts, and then they would take their removed body parts and they would throw them into houses, and then the people would come out and give them female clothing to wear. So it was very
So
disgusting
so if
practice.
you think
Yeah.
we're in a bad society, it
Yeah.
can get a whole lot worse.
Well,
It
they
can get
had
a
these
whole lot worse.
Yes, they had these parades. They had these parades too, these gala. It's just it's quite the things I read were quite disturbing, and, a lot of these things I cannot unread, so, in my research for
Well,
this book.
yeah, thanks for, doing it so we don't have to. So I'm assuming though, you've let me ask you this. What age is appropriate for reading your book?
Okay, that's fair. That's a good question. Good
Yeah.
question. So I am not a fan of gratuitous violence or gratuitous sex. But the book it does have mature themes. I mean, it is a story of redemption, by the way. There is repentance, there's redemption, there's judgment, there's sacrifice of the good kind, but there's also sin. There I do describe an event of child sacrifice. I do describe an event of sexual perversion in the terms of worship of Ashra, but I don't I want to be I want to be as careful as possible. And yes, we recognize what's happening, but I'm not going to be gratuitous in that. So, but I would say a mature high schooler could read my book, and hopefully they see very clearly that the sin is the sin. That's a problem. But God, God
Good.
is good, and there's repentance there.
Yeah. What do you predict will happen if things continue as they are now with, well, you live in Pennsylvania. I don't know what it's like where you are, but I know where I am. I'm seeing more paganism, witchcraft. We have in my area several shops that are overtly pagan and witchcraft type shops, and it's seen as a very cool thing now. It's an interesting thing. It's even the term witchy is used a lot. I've noticed like that, and I don't know in what quarters exactly, but I know that we had recently, my wife and I had gone to this thing, and I'll leave the specifics out of it, but the person who
Mhm.
was running it just kept saying witchy, witchy, witchy. And I know
Hmm.
that like they apply it broadly, but I'm picking up on these very little things and also very overt things that just tell me it's getting darker. And with that, I'm assuming that these practices that you seem to be indicating that there's a universality to them. They will start coming back, and in some ways, maybe they already are in secular forms. But I wonder to what extent abortion and uh, the LGBTQ plus stuff and sexual perversion are going to become more common, more normalized, and more religious. Specifically, like, will there be like a, a religious connection to these things?
I think so. I think I've read that there are groups that are trying to argue that because they're fearful that their so-called rights to abortion will be taken away, so they're arguing on a First Amendment basis that that it is a religious practice to be able to sacrifice your children, which you know apart from a Christian worldview, I don't know how you argue against that because the ancient Aztecs and the Incans and the Mayans, they engaged in human sacrifice and cannibalism,
Right.
and that was part of their worship practices.
Right. Right.
So I don't see how you can argue that. And I do think that there's a reason why God in His Word says you don't mess with witchcraft. You don't engage with mediums. You don't do those things because in all of those things, people are trying to seek power and knowledge, but not from God. They're trying to seek power and knowledge from other sources, which are demonic, and there's always a price to pay, and the demons will demand the sacrifice, the ultimate sacrifice of the image of God, and so that's why I think you're going to start to see increase of these practices. You want to increase witchcraft, you're going to start to increase talking to the dead. You're going to start to increase spells and the casting of spells and cutting yourself, offering up of blood, and including offering up of children and androgyny, destroying the image of God in you. All of it is really a false gospel. I mean, and I'll just be brief here. Transgenderism is perhaps one of the greatest examples of a false gospel, and here's why it is. Because from the transgender mindset, basically the argument is that the way God made you was wrong, and that you can decide in your mind based on how you feel. You can kind of speak yourself into existence. Now, we all know that only God can speak things into existence ex nihilo. He says, and it is. But when a human tries to do it, I say that I'm this gender, and therefore I am. I say, and I am. I make myself after my own image, and then my goal then is to make the world conform to that. You have to use the pronouns that I have decided for myself. I need to reshape my body and cut off parts and do surgery in order to remake myself into my own image. And you've heard people talk about how you can't dead name the person. To use their old name or their old pronouns is to dead name them. So in a sense, when a person has transitioned, the old person has died and a new person has come to life. And we as Christians would say, no, 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 no. Only in Christ does the old man die. And in Christ is newness of life. You're a new person in Christ, made an image of God, and now you're being conformed to the image of His Son. But that's not true with transgenderism. Now you're making yourself in your own image, denying the image of God, and then the image of God dies, and this new image of yourself, which is ultimately of the devil, is now come to life, and you go on and you proclaim this new false gospel where you feel liberated and you have peace and you're seeking peace and wholeness and shalom. But you're not going to get that by transitioning. You're going to get that only through Christ. And I think we're starting to see, though, this is a positive thing, that those individuals that engaged in transitioning and had those surgeries, they're realizing that it's not fulfilling them. They're even more empty, more distraught than before, and they're realizing that it's all just a lie. And my prayer is that they will, come to faith in Christ, find healing
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. No, that's excellent. I think so many people, even people who grew up with Christian backgrounds, are taken in by this stuff, um, under the guise that it's loving and it's part of being a tolerant person with good manners to accept these blurrings of distinctions. And it's not. I mean, I don't want to accuse everyone who started to go down that path as, like they are overtly out there making sacrifices to Moloch, but you are beginning a path that takes you away from God. And the deeper you get, yeah, I mean, it winds up in idolatry. It winds up in, you are, that's exactly what you're doing. You are in a pagan religion. I've thought this for a while, but it's hard, I think, with the more secular people, or even like, people who have a sort of a cultural Christian bent, but they have these secular assumptions. It's hard for them to see this, which is part of the reason I'm glad to have you on to talk about it, because I think they need to see that we live in this very religious world, this immaterial world that has spirits and demons and angels and these kinds of things. I mean, I believe that, and I think more and more people are starting to come to that, but there's still this large group of people who just think, government should be very separate from religion, and religion's this very personal thing, and there's really no reality to it on a social level or in the real world, as we say. It's just this thing that you cling to get through life, and it's not. It's more than that.
Yes, absolutely. One of the things that really struck me from Jonathan Cahn's book, Return of the Gods, is he centered his argument on Matthew chapter 12 and verses 43 through 45. It's a very short statement that Jesus makes, but he says that in Matthew 12, he says, when the unclean spirit has gone out of a person, it passes through waterless places seeking rest, but finds none.
I've wondered about that verse.
Then it says, I will return to my house from which I came. And when it comes, it finds the house empty, swept, and put in order. Then it goes and brings with it 7 other spirits more evil than itself. And they enter and dwell there. And the last state of the person is worse than the first. So also will it be with this evil generation. So Jesus takes a story about a person, and he applies it to a generation, a corporate setting. And Jonathan Cahn's argument is that, that happens culturally too, where you have a nation or a society, let's say, that gets rid of the demons. It gets rid of the idolatry, and then for a time it's clean, it's worshiping God, it's great. But unless if it gets rid of God, if it rejects God, if it throws God out of the public square and says, we don't want you anymore, we're going to have an empty but clean. We're going to have a clean, empty house is what we're going to have. It's not going to stay empty forever. If it's not indwelt by the Holy Spirit, it's going to be indwelt by unclean spirits. And so Cahn's argument is that, these demons, they never really went away. They just move around from place to place. And, as the gospel spreads, they're pushed out. They're pushed away from those societies, and they have to just keep fleeing. But they find those places that are a new home for them. And I think that given that our society has basically rejected God and wants to have an empty house, it's going to be filled with demons now, and they're coming back strong and in force. So
yeah, well, it's a quote, Bob Dylan, you got to serve somebody, right? So that's there is no neutrality in this, and that's what I think people need to realize. If you're concerned, if you're like Elon Musk or Joe Rogan or these figures who are definitely secular, Elon Musk overtly so, but he realizes, it's funny, he's been tweeting things like, we need a aggressive kind of Christianity. Like, he sees the social I guess use for Christianity or necessity of it, but you can't just mix it in as if, let's like, oh, well, this is for the stability of your country, here's a little Christianity. Like, there has to be something true in it. And I don't know. I think some of these guys, I think, are going to realize as things get darker more and more that, oh, wait a minute, like, I can't be neutral anymore. I can't even be like, I can't transcend these discussions as if they're really not important. They're just it's like the whole idea that, like, oh, it's for the kids, religion for the kids. But like, for me as an adult, I don't really need it. Like, they're going to find out, no, we do. Like, you need it even more, actually. And there are forces of darkness and light. And so I think there's tremendous opportunity for Christians right now to be on the right side of this, to be on the side of light, and and not try to dabble in this neutral framing of the subject, which I'm sure your book contributes to that.
That's my goal. That's my goal.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you a question. I don't know if this
Sure.
changes gears too much, but there's something I've been noticing this, and it's very, very uh, minor, tame, not that influential at this point, but as far as I know. But I know that there's on some of the fringes, the outskirts of those on the if you want to call it the dissident right, which I think is sort of an envelope term to describe just about everyone who's not in the establishment or who is not a neoconservative, we'll say. That's become kind of like this umbrella term. And in the dissident right, you have your Christian nationalist types, but you also have your like Bronze Age pervert, your pagan nationalist types, and your I don't even know. There's so many varieties, but so here's what I'm getting to. There's this strain, and I've been noticing it for a little while, of trying to bring back. Mostly, it's two kinds, or three, if you want to call it, but really broadly speaking, two kinds of mythologies: Greco-Roman, okay, and then Norse type stuff. And I've never claimed to be an expert on either civilization, but I have read quite a bit about both, and I'm thinking, like, especially with my reading of like the Nazis and stuff, you had basically, Himmler, who ran the SS, was very into Nazi occult stuff, Volk religion stuff. And I mean, he even established the, if I can pronounce it, Wewelsburg Castle. And there were practices done there that were in honor of these ancient pre-Christian. So that's one of their claims, right? Is that, like, we're pre-Christian, these deities, and Woden or Odin, Thor. These were some of the figures in that pantheon, supposedly. So here's the question. I know I took a long time setting this up, but do you see parallels with what you're talking about, these ancient religions, and not just the left? Because I would ascribe kind of like abortion, the LGBT stuff. That's on the side of, we would associate that with political liberalism. But do you see, like, it's not, I wouldn't call it conservative at all, but at least on some quarters of what claims to be the right and the alternative to the left, do you see rising similar spirits that will lead to similar places?
I think there's some danger there. You got to be careful about. I just finished reading through Augustine City of God, and in that book, the setting is that the Roman Empire is collapsing, and Rome had just been, not too long earlier, been sacked. And a lot of the Roman pagans are accusing the Christians. They're basically blaming the Christians. They're saying, well, if we had just honored the gods faithfully, we would still be strong. It's because of Christianity that the empire is no longer as glorious and powerful as it was. And Augustine goes to argue, no, actually, your republic had many restraints in it, and the behavior was actually more virtuous and more in line with what God would consider to be righteousness than what you're doing, today with your worship of Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars and all that kind of stuff. So I think there's always a tendency to, when things are bad, to say, okay, when were things good? And from the Roman pagan perspective, it's like, well, things weren't too bad when we were, under Marcus Aurelius, and we had the empire, and everyone feared us, and we were worshiping pagan deities. And but that's a trap. That's a trap, because the Bible is very clear. God is very clear that not just for Israel, but the pagan nations, right? Like, he is patient and long suffering. I mean, he told Abraham, the time of the Ammonite or the Amorite is not yet complete, right? So 400 years later, that's when God brings judgment to the Canaanites and the Ammonites and Amorites. 400 years later, but even before, so God had given them so much time,
right?
And he's so patient and long suffering. And you might be tempted to think, well, things are doing great. well, no, they're not great. They're not great. You're actually living in sin and you're on your way to death. But God is actually being merciful to you, but he's not bringing judgment right away. But so don't trick yourself into thinking that going after these pagan deities is going to bring you, victory and prosperity and glory. No, the only way is through Christ. That would be my thought there.
Yeah, and in specifically like in Germany, I mean, I'm using that as an example just because I've
Mhm.
studied it more. I'm sure you could see similar situations in other kind of post-Christian countries, but in Germany, because that's where higher criticism came out of, that's where neo-orthodoxy came out of.
Mhm.
You had such a weak, anemic church that was really inconsequential for the most part. Um, there was a vacuum, and you saw pagan things start to come in and fill that vacuum.
Yeah.
And I think we're seeing something similar today. We're behind where they were, and I think it's probably arguable now that you go to Germany, now it's like, what sense of, or any European country almost, what is left of Christianity in these places? They
Mm.
are There are overt pagan things happening now in these places. Um, and now Islam's filling the gap in so many of them, right?
Well,
Like, and
yeah.
it's not just because of immigration. This is one of the key things. Immigration's obviously that's that started this, and it's a huge part of this. But they're literally making converts in these countries,
Yes.
partially because they actually believe in something.
Yeah, exactly. The materialistic secular worldview. I mean, that you're just you're just a material thing. Life doesn't matter. Nothing happens after you die. You're meaningless. Da 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 da. Okay, well, that's really fulfilling and hopeful. I mean,
Right.
so Islam offers meaning, purpose, and an afterlife. And for men, Islam offers power and glory and strength. Um, but obviously not a biblical concept of either of those things.
Is there a parallel between the ancient religions and Allah? I know I've read this before, that
I think
Allah.
that yeah, I think there probably is. I mean, Allah is so I've been in the military for 18 years or so now, and most of my life has been spent dealing with Islamic extremism. So I really I've done some study of Islam, but read the Quran, but it's been a bit since I've gone through it again. But from what I understanding, Allah is a being of pure power. He's kind of arbitrary because you could engage in all the five pillars of Islam. You could do all the things and still end up going to hell when you die. The
Mm,
best chance you have, the best possible chance of almost guaranteeing heaven, paradise, is to die in jihad. And if so, that's the kind of the best chance you have of that. Even then, it's not really a guarantee, but he's essentially pure power. I remember there was a story because when I was in pilot training, one of the things that the United States Air Force has done is we would help train pilots from other countries. It's kind of a gesture of goodwill and of building relations. But I remember we had pilots from Muslim countries, but their idea of Allah's will, it affected them. I remember hearing about a student, a Muslim student pilot, who's flying. It's a single engine propeller aircraft, and the American instructor is behind, and the engine fails, and the student just lets go of the controls and says, "Well, Allah willed it. Allah wills it. That's what he wants." And the
hmm.
and the American pilot's like, "Oh, no, he doesn't," and takes control of the aircraft and recovers it. I think gets the engine started back up again and things like that. So it's almost like a fatalism,
Yeah, deterministic.
very deterministic, not Calvinistic, deterministic
Yep.
fatalism. Allah wills it, so that's it. I don't have to do anything. I have no responsibility there.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's kind of convenient to live that way, I guess. Like, but that's not, God does want us to use our minds. Well, we need to probably end the podcast here soon,
sure.
but people can go pick up your book at ericluppold.com and check out, if they're going to start, you have 3 books. What should they start with?
Well, they're not really related. Although I would say Image of Gold. The
Okay.
Tyranny of Our Idolatry. Image of Gold, that's a nonfiction book about idolatry. If you are really interested in that and what it means to worship something after the image and likeness of something else, that book would be good. But Through the Fire is a standalone book there.
All right. Very cool. I
Yeah.
appreciate you coming on the podcast, Eric, and sharing with us all of this, and hope you get some more sales and boosts from it. And if you're someone who's wondering about these ancient gods and the connections to some of today's practices, or ancient false gods, I should say, check it out. So God bless.
Thank you, John. Take care.